Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Henry Moore Studios and Gardens. It's a pleasure to be here with you today to explore the 1974 book, portfolio, and lithograph series, Auden Poems, Moore Lithographs. This afternoon's event is part of our 2025 season Encounters, looking at the people surrounding Henry Moore and their contribution to his work, life, and career. Many of the most cogent and detailed theories of Moore's art seem simplistic when faced with the work itself. In tribute to this fact, today will be an opportunity not just to hear the history of this project, but also to experience the unique accompaniment of the artist's visuals and Auden's words. For this, I'm delighted to be joined by the multi-award-winning poet and writer Michael Symmons Roberts, whose 2023 Radio 4 series, The Three Faces of W.H. Auden, marked 50 years since the poet's death. Michael has been working towards today's event hot on the heels of the publication of his book, Quartet for the End of Time, on music, grief, and birdsong, an exploration of the music of the French composer Olivier Messiaen. A little on today's format. So Michael and I will be taking it in turns to present this body of work to you. We'll begin with a short historical overview from me. Michael will then introduce and perform some of the contents of the portfolio in sequence with Moore's illustrations. I'll then proceed with some comments on the image's place in Moore's work, and then after some more poems, we'll finish with a discussion and hopefully some questions from you. Before we begin in earnest, all that remains for me to do is to thank Michael very much for being here and to thank you as well. Okay, so Moore's Auden lithographs rank amongst his darkest and strangest images. Through withholding economy, they convey a sense of distance and disorientation. In them, we see landscape and the human form, cornerstones of the artist's work, in an unfamiliar register. Less celebration, less certainty, a more complicated synthesis. This effect of disquiet is a testament to the series' coherence. Despite several being based on earlier work, the lithographs have a definite look, that of blackness and density. On Auden's side, continuity is less straightforward. Whilst Moore closely marshalled the production of his illustrations, Auden didn't live to see the project to its conclusion, suffering a fatal heart attack months from its end. The 13 works included were not selected by the poet. They come from multiple stages of his career and in several cases are present as excerpts. They differ in tone, and while some motifs and themes recur, most prominently night and love, it's not clear at first glance that they express complementary ideas. Whilst our archive resources here at the Foundation are not complete, Auden's perception of or vision for the project are almost completely absent from the sources that we do hold. Yet, I would argue that Auden Poems, Moore Lithographs is a powerful work. Whether it's more a mixture of powerful ingredients or a powerful compound is something I've wondered about since beginning to look at it closely. Fortunately, we needn't make a final decision on this, but hopefully today's presentation will provide or enhance an impression of the kind of encounter that Moore and Auden had. The project's year-and-a-half-long span begins in November of 1972 with a meeting between Moore and Auden here at Perry Green. Auden had returned to Britain from the USA a few months before, taking residence at his old Oxford college. The meeting was initiated by Vera Russell, who'd known Moore for over 40 years and helped organise several of his exhibitions in the 1970s. As Moore's assistant and longtime curator of the Henry Moore Foundation, David Mitchinson, recalls, Russell's vision was to, quote, bring together the work of two prominent Yorkshiremen who had achieved such eminence in their respective disciplines. Both were indeed eminent. Auden, prolific and authoritative, had won the Pulitzer Prize in 1948 and served as Oxford Professor of poetry between 1956 and 1961. Moore's recently closed retrospective, symbolically staged on Michelangelo's home turf of Florence, had attracted 345,000 visitors in 5 months, amongst them Princess Margaret, Edward Heath, and pictured here, Italian President Giovanni Leone. That Russell should instigate Moore and Auden's collaboration was fitting. She'd been present for their only other creative work together, taking a role in the group theatre's performance of Auden's play The Dance of Death in 1934, for which Moore had designed a mask. You can see a sketch here on the left, which in the 1980s made its way into the Foundation's collection. Whilst the pair had several friends in common, amongst them the painter Robert Medley and the poet Stephen Spender, the latter of whose writing on Moore will come up at several points during today's talk, there's nothing to suggest a substantial personal relationship between the two men preceded or followed the Dance of Death. Our fragmentary records suggest that Russell oversaw the selection of poems by the publisher and editor Nikos Stangos in the early months of 1973. You can see a diary entry just here with Stangos visiting, with Moore beginning on the lithographs that February, assisted by Bud Shark of the Petersburg Press, who published the work, and Stanley Jones of the Kirwan Press, who played a major role in much of Moore's lithographic production. Although the artist professed to high regard for Auden's writing, he admitted to difficulties. Moore's work on Auden overlapped with work on his Stonehenge series, with several of the latter forming the basis of his illustrations. Here's Moore speaking in 1974, hopefully if it works, on how Stonehenge helped him overcome his initial problems.
And first it was suggested one to illustrate a selection of Auden poems. I was interested because I've always had my opinion. I've read, not everything he's written by a long way, but I've read a lot. And being not exactly contemporary, but knowing him from the 30s onwards and barren, I was interested. And I began to look at the poems and read them, but I couldn't really get going. I couldn't really get excited. I tried the most obvious one, the Leo Sleeping Hair, which is a beautiful poem, which is a very moving, a very touching, a beautiful poem, and one began illustrating it in a straightforward, like somebody illustrated Alice in Wonderland or anything with a pictorial story. But I realized that after that, and reading some of the other poems, they couldn't be illustrated like Dickens illustrated. It just wasn't like the human and the mighty. A few ones fitted in with my mood and direction that the Stonehenge brought about. And then I began to get really into it. And one realized that it probably was better to not attempt to illustrate poems, but to complement or even contrast, or to be two people who were different coming together.
Auden and Moore's next and final meeting would not happen until the following September. During the intervening months, Moore suffered a debilitating bout of pleurisy that Mitchinson remembers left him with a heightened sense of mortality. Work on the lithographs continued during this period and was far progressed by the time the poet and artist were reunited. Auden's biographer, Richard Davenport Hines, portrays the poet's final year as one of poor health and mental decline, quoting an Oxford colleague's description of Auden during this period as a husk of a great man, battered, tired, more sick, I suppose, than anyone knew. Auden, who lived part-time in Austria, met Moore at an event in Vienna to celebrate an upcoming sculptural commission. 10 days later, the poet was dead at the age of 66. Moore continued work on the prints until December. Their publication the following year was marked by an exhibition of prints and drawings at the British Museum, charting a history of drawing in black with works by influences on the Auden series like Rembrandt, Segers and Seurat, and earlier examples of his own work, including his wartime coal mine drawings. The show ended with a section dedicated to Auden. One of the later additions to the book was a set of portraits Moore made of the poet in his memory, emphasizing the landscape likeness of his characteristically lined face. The final product was a deluxe book with Moore's illustrations originally made in lithography printed alongside Auden's poems. You can see it at the back there. From the mid-1960s, Moore's print production markedly increased, and over half of Moore's total graphic output was published as part of such volumes. Each book included a set of the lithograph edition. There were two versions, one for sale in Europe and another for the USA. Each version assigned a different selection. A further portfolio was sold separately, which contained another set of lithographs without Auden poems. And while some of these were not made to accompany specific literary works, they were still identified as part of the project. I'll now turn to Michael for his first selection of poems and illustrations. For this, we've chosen those accompanying the two illustrations Moore refers to in the audio excerpt as Lay Your Sleeping Head and Multitude, that being Lullaby and the Shield of Achilles. Also, one of the ways that Moore built on Russell's founding idea of his and Auden's Yorkshire link was through landscape imagery. And for that, we've selected the poems The Lesson and Lords for this. So welcome, Michael, to the stage.
Thank you very much, Tom. I'd like to say thank you to Tom in particular and everyone at the Henry Moore Foundation for their generosity to me and for commissioning me in the first place, but also opening up the archives for me. And it's been a fantastic process, so I feel very lucky to have been involved. As Tom said, I'm really here to read the poems, but for those who don't know Auden's poems well, or haven't heard them for a while, and there's quite odd choices that were chosen for this collaboration. So some of them are lesser known, some of them are the absolute knock you down Auden classics. So I'll give a short introduction to them before reading them. But it's worth just saying from Auden's side very briefly, the other side of what Tom was saying about the status. It's hard to overestimate the status of these two artists when they came together as a collaborative partnership, because you just heard how celebrated and famous Moore was at this point. Auden was, for a poet, super famous. I mean, off the scale famous. Poetry fame tends to come like 2 centuries after your death, but this is a poet who'd been on Parkinson, the Saturday night BBC chat show, shambling on in his slippers to be interviewed. This is serious fame. So he's not just fated in literary circles, he's a very famous figure. He's also very ill, as again Tom was saying. I've heard a recording of the last reading he gave in Vienna on the night he died. And it's clear, and I think it was probably clear in the weeks before, that he knew that he was coming to the end of his life. It had the feeling, that reading, of a very valedictory event, thanking people who've been in his life. So you've got two very famous, and in Auden's case, really very ill, late in life artists with extraordinary work to share. I'm going to begin with one of those super famous Auden poems, perhaps the most famous. Lay Your Sleeping Head, My Love, is the first line by which most people know. It's also called Lullaby. So this is young Auden. This is 1937. He starts writing it maybe late 20s, 30. And one of his great themes is love. And this is one of his great love lyrics. There's a clue in the title. He calls it Lullaby. And for those of you who remember being sung to as a child, it's exactly the same rhythm as the most famous lullaby, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. It lulls you into that sense of something beautiful and slightly hypnotic and mysterious. It's been described, I think correctly, as a post-coital lullaby. So it is a love poem, but it's got Auden's great themes in all his love poems. It's melancholic. It's worried about the future of this love. It's ethical. He's obsessed with the ethics of what it means to be a poet, what it means to be a lover, what it means to be in society. So there's a self-reproach to this as well. And you'll hear that self-reproach right at the beginning of the poem in the second line. Edward Mendelssohn, who's perhaps the greatest Auden scholar and knew Auden very well, said this is the first poem in the English language where the speaker confesses his own infidelity. He blames it on the human condition here, says Mendelssohn, but in later work blames it on himself. So this is very early Auden, very famous poem called Lullaby. Lay your sleeping head, my love, human on my faithless arm. Time and fevers burn away individual beauty from thoughtful children, and the grave proves the child ephemeral. But in my arms till break of day, let the living creature lie, mortal, guilty, but to me the entirely beautiful. Soul and body have no bounds to lovers as they lie upon her tolerant enchanted slope in their ordinary swoon. Grave the vision Venus sends of supernatural sympathy, universal love and hope, while an abstract insight wakes among the glaciers and the rocks, the hermit's carnal ecstasy. Certainty, fidelity, on the stroke of midnight pass like vibrations of a bell, and fashionable madmen raise their pedantic boring cry. Every farthing of the cost all the dreaded cards foretell shall be paid, but from this night not a whisper, not a thought, not a kiss nor look be lost. Beauty, midnight, vision, dies. Let the winds of dawn that blow softly round your dreaming head such a day of welcome show. I and knocking heart may bless, find our mortal world enough. Noons of dryness find you fed by the involuntary powers. Nights of insult let you pass, watched by every human love. It's worth saying for those who don't know, this is Auden at the age of 30 is already a gay man, and his love poems are addressed to men. But there's in these early poems in particular, there's a veiled sense in which, ironically, I think that's one of the reasons these love poems have been adopted so universally as a symbol of a giver's love to somebody else. They write them in a card or whatever. They're very unspecific about the lover, and that's partly, I think, he's a poet who plays with the borders between personal and universal, but it's also very practically, you know, he's a gay man at a time when acting upon that was illegal. So that's part of the hiddenness. Shortly after he wrote that poem, he, along with a lot of young writers and intellectuals at the time, sympathetic with the left and anxious and angry about the rise of right-wing totalitarianism across Europe in the 1930s, he volunteered to go and serve as a medic in the Spanish Civil War. And this poem relates back to Auden's time at the Spanish Civil War. But I'll say a little bit about the complexities of his views of writing about war later on. But this one's called The Shield of Achilles, and it's become probably his most famous political poem, certainly his most famous war poem. It's a kind of reflects a Christian existential outlook, which Auden had at the time. So there's a sense in which without some faith, all hope is lost. You know, there's a bleakness to this. The Shield of Achilles, the title and the premise for the poem, comes from the Iliad. And this is Hephaestus, the great, well, described in the poem, the thin-lipped armourer. This is the man who makes a shield for Achilles to go into battle with. And the key thing is Thetis, mother of Achilles, is watching over the shoulder of the armourer as he emblazons these patterns on the shield, and they're kind of like charms or motifs to inspire and defend the warrior. And as you're hear in the poem, in this version of the scene, the images emblazoned on the scenes are not all glorious or heroic in the way that she's hoping. The shield of Achilles. She looked over his shoulder for vines and olive trees, marble well-governed cities and ships upon untamed seas. But there, on the shining metal, his hands had put instead an artificial wilderness and a sky like lead. A plain without a feature, bare and brown, no blade of grass, no sign of neighbourhood, nothing to eat and nowhere to sit down. Yet, congregated on its blankness stood an unintelligible multitude, a million eyes, a million boots in line, without expression, waiting for a sign. Out of the air, a voice without a face, proved by statistics that some cause was just, in tones as dry and level as the place. No one was cheered, and nothing was discussed. Column by column in a cloud of dust, they marched away, enduring a belief whose logic brought them somewhere else to grief. She looked over his shoulder for ritual pieties, white flower garlanded heifers, libation and sacrifice. But there, on the shining metal, where the altar should have been, she saw by his flickering forge light quite another scene. Barbed wire enclosed an arbitrary spot where bored officials lounged, one cracked a joke, and sentries sweated for the day was hot. A crowd of ordinary decent folk watched from without, and neither moved nor spoke, as three pale figures were led forth and bound to three posts driven upright in the ground. The mass and majesty of this world, all that carries weight and always weighs the same, lay in the hands of others. They were small and could not hope for help, and no help came. What their foes liked to do was done. Their shame was all the worst could wish. They lost their pride and died as men before their bodies died. She looked over his shoulder for athletes at their games, men and women in a dance, moving their sweet limbs, quick, quick to music. But there, on the shining shield, his hands had set no dancing floor, but a weed-choked field. A ragged urchin, aimless and alone, loitered about that vacancy. A bird flew up to safety from his well-aimed stone. That girls are raped, that two boys knife a third, were axioms to him, who'd never heard of any world where promises were kept, or one could weep because another wept. The thin-lipped armourer, Hephaestus, hobbled away. Thetis of the shining breasts cried out in dismay at what the god had wrought to please her son, the strong, iron-hearted, man-slaying Achilles, who would not live long. And just to briefly say, we could discuss this more later if you want. Auden had a complex relationship with his political poetry and his anti-war poetry, some of which he turned against and tried to remove from publication later because he didn't believe that they were true or ethical. He felt that they were self-aggrandizing rather than actually efficacious, but that one he stuck by. Now we're moving on to 1942 in this first section of 4 poems. This is the third, and this is, again, there's a moral questioning in this poem which is very characteristic of him. It's set in 3 sonnets, and Auden is playing jazz with the sonnet form here, so they're not all 14 lines and they're not all structurally like sonnets. It's 3 sonnets to be precise and a coda at the end. And it studies in, again, his great theme, the egotism of romantic love, the complexities of trying to find integrity and authenticity in romantic love, and who's responsible for that. And in the end of this poem, as you'll find when you come to it, the conclusion he draws is, you cannot will love, because eros, sexual love, is a gift you cannot will. You can't decide who you ought to be in love with. You are or you aren't. The lesson. The first time that I dreamed we were in flight and fagged with running, there was civil war, a valley full of thieves and wounded bears. Farms blazed behind us, turning to the right. We came at once to a tall house, its door wide open, waiting for its long-lost heirs. An elderly clerk sat on the bedroom stairs, writing, but we had tiptoed past him when he raised his head and stuttered, "Go away." We wept and begged to stay. He wiped his pince-nez, hesitated, then said no, he had no power to give us leave. Our lives were not in order, we must leave. The second dream began in a May wood. We had been laughing. Your blue eyes were kind, your excellent nakedness without disdain. Our lips met, wishing universal good, but on their impact sudden flame and wind fetched you away and turned me loose again, to make a focus for a wide, wild plain, dead level and dead silent and bone dry, where nothing could have suffered, sinned or grown. On a high chair alone I sat, a little master, asking why the cold and solid object in my hands should be a human hand, one of your hands. And the last dream was this. We were to go to a great banquet and a victory ball after some tournament or dangerous test. Our cushions were of crimson velvet, so we must have won, though there were no crowns for all. Ours were of gold, of paper, all the rest. Fair, wise, or funny was each famous guest. Love smiled at courage over priceless glass, and rockets died in hundreds to express our learned carelessness. A band struck up. All over the green grass, a sea of paper crowns rose up to dance. Ours were too heavy. We did not dance. I woke. You were not there. But as I dressed, anxiety turned to shame, feeling all three intended one rebuke. For had not each in its own way tried to teach my will to love you that it cannot be? As I think of such consequence to want, what anyone is given if they want. And the final one from this first section of the poems comes from a sequence, it's one of my favourite sequences of his, called Hore Canonicae, which is based on the monastic day, the hours, the offices of the monastic day. This is 1952, so I guess Auden had so many peaks, it's hard to say it's peak Auden, but he's certainly a mastery of his powers at this point. The way he does with the monastic hours is rich and complex, and there's beautiful passages on identity and responsibility again, but also he's reaching for to understand more about his regained sense of faith and spirituality at this point, as its subject suggests. So Lauds in the Book of Hours, for those that don't know, in the hours of the monastic day, is the start of the day. Normally in monasteries this is conducted at 3 a.m, which is certainly earlier than I start my day, but that's because you start in the darkness and then generally it goes through to light. So at the start of this poem he brings in the dawn chorus, which you will hear mentioned early on, and it's got a refrain that keeps looping round, which you'll hear: in solitude for company. And this is again a great Audenesque theme, that the individual exists within the company, the community, and only exists in that context. So he's asking a blessing for both. And the final thing I'll say, you will hear, because I can't but hear it every time I read it, there's an oddness to this. It feels unhappy in the skin of its form. And he's conscious of that. He's conscious of all the effects of his formal decisions. In this case, he's making an English poem in a version of a 13th century Spanish form, which I believe is pronounced the cosante. So this is Lauds from Hora Canonicae. Among the leaves the small birds sing. The crow of the cock commands a waking in solitude for company. Bright shines the sun on creatures mortal. Men of their neighbours become sensible in solitude for company. The crow of the cock commands a waking. Already the mass bell goes dong ding in solitude for company. Men of their neighbours become sensible. God bless the realm. God bless the people in solitude for company. Already the mass bell goes dong ding. The dripping mill wheel is again turning in solitude for company. God bless the realm. God bless the people. God bless this green world temporal in solitude for company. The dripping mill wheel is again turning. Among the leaves the small birds sing in solitude for company. I'll hand back to Tom now.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's great. So I was going to speak for a little bit about, how the images look and perhaps some reasons why. Darkness is a well-established metaphor for existential uncertainty. In the case of the Auden series, Moore's exploration of uncertainty through darkness is specially informed by his deep attunement to three-dimensional form. This was so even in a body of two-dimensional work, since especially early in Moore's career, drawing was a fundamental part of the imagining and reimagining of form necessary for making sculpture. As John Russell states, for Moore, nothing can be entirely known until he has drawn it. Of course, Moore's expertise in understanding and manipulating form were part of his achievement as a sculptor. He repeatedly insisted that good sculptural work depended on the thorough exploration of three-dimensional form. In a straightforward way, then, darkness carries apt symbolic weight as that which deprives us of understanding. Yet for Moore, the harder to measure, or indeed unmeasurable aspects of our perception were important to how he conceived his sculpture. Form is felt as well as seen, whilst darkness takes away in the sense of information of purely accumulative vision. Low or uneven light adds to our impression of it. He discusses this recalling the enduring memory formed on the evening of his first visit to Stonehenge as a student. Unfortunately, we don't have a recording of this, so I'm going to have to voice more. So this is his first visit to Stonehenge. After eating, I decided I wouldn't wait to see Stonehenge until the next day. As it was a clear evening, I got to Stonehenge and saw it by moonlight. I was alone and tremendously impressed. Moonlight, as you know, enlarges everything, and the mysterious depths and distances made it seem enormous. I went again the next morning, and it was still very impressive, but that first moonlight remained for years my idea of Stonehenge. This play of physical form and subjective impression shapes the setting of many of Moore's drawings for sculpture. Despite seeming to suggest some form of narrative, thus occupying a purely imaginative realm, the atmosphere conveyed by the drawn sculpture's presence in rooms, in landscapes, or with people informs the development towards the sculpture that Moore would go on to make. He would try and preserve the atmosphere of this imaginative setting in drawing in the eventual physical form, a sense of the unseen living on in the scene. Here's Moore speaking again.
From the beginnings, I was interested pictorially in making an object taste in its state. Having a room, and one did a whole lot of those sculptures in rooms, or that one related one or two objects to each other, drawing the space between them. In fact, the pictorial drawings connect very clearly in my mind with my making holes in sculpture, which is trying to make the back of the sculpture connect through to the front. That is, thinking of the back of something as well as the front. And so from the beginning, there have been drawings which some people might think were more pictorial than sculptural. But to me, the putting a thing into space is exactly the same problem as drawing form.
The Auden series, with its repeated use of fragmentation and confusion of perspective, demonstrates both the privation and the enhancement that not seeing represents for Moore. Perhaps this is most prevalent in the recurrent appearance of cropped lines amongst the Auden lithographs. In Multitude, which is here on the left, the beginning and end of the line of walkers is set beyond our viewpoint, blending an impression of the eternal and the unknown. In Divided Landscape on the right, the line separating the halves of Moore's image muddies a clear sense of topographical fidelity, cementing the impression that what we're looking at is at least partially abstract. It's interesting to note that in forcing us to see one way, well or less well, the two-dimensional artwork possesses a kind of tyrannical power that the three-dimensional artwork lacks. Along the same lines, one might argue that Moore's use of sculptural fragmentation concentrates rather than withholds meaning, more paraphrase than syllable. In other areas of Moore's work, barriers to knowledge are important. Stephen Spender, writing towards the end of the artist's life, discusses the appeal of the intuitive and the unconscious, the positive role that not quite knowing what he's doing served. Moore also discussed his own wish to instill a sense of mystery into his works, to dramatize in various ways the feeling of seeking irrespective of finding. We hear this in this clip.
I've always been more than intrigued, been fascinated by the mystery in life, by the mystery in the world. That is something that you don't immediately understand, that you have to look at and work about, and which can even be interpreted in one or two different ways, if you wish. So that take, for instance, the drawing of the tied up object. There, the object that tied up, the thing that the whole point of the drawing for me, when the idea of it came to me, was that the tied up object is a mystery, that nobody knows what's underneath it, that the crowd is looking at this object, wondering what's there, perhaps expecting that it came to me as a kind of unveiling of a Softian puppet. So that in that drawing, the mystery, the unknown object is part of it.
So as Michael has noted, love is a pertinent theme, perhaps permanent, in the selection of Auden's poems. But as Michael has also noted in our conversations whilst preparing for today's event, this version of love is infused with painful impermanence, congenitally bonded to death or deceit. You may perhaps have heard this in the lines of Lullaby's opening stanza, "Time and fevers burn away, individual beauty from thoughtful children, and the grave proves the child ephemeral. But in my arms till break of day, let the living creature lie, mortal, guilty, but to me the entirely beautiful. The intensity of this passage comes, to borrow Michael's phrase, from Auden's sense of carpe diem. Love, indeed life, will end. The choice to love anyway is elevated by being staked against immutable loss. Moore's illustrations of Auden's work are marked by the ambiguity of human connection between the pairs or groups of figures depicted, or to us as viewers of presences that may or may not be human. These relationships are not what they seem. Like the relationship of Auden's lovers, they're permeated by absence and contradiction. Perhaps appropriate to Moore's love of mystery, they can only seem. The first lullaby illustration is an example. It seems straightforwardly an image of protective embrace, yet details complicate this impression. The male figure is larger, looming over the sleeping woman. She appears to be bent over in a sitting position, enclosed by his body. He blends into darkness, wakeful and watchful, while she rests unconscious in the lightest part of the image. It's possible that Moore experimented with the injection of nascent threat into the composition as he worked it out. The different placements of the sleeper's head in this sketch for the work seem to convey a variety of interactions between the two figures. In Cavern, the illustration for Auden's The Three Companions, we again see something of a cropped line casting human presence into doubt. The rising feminine curve of the form in the foreground seems clearly figurative. We cannot see a whole body, however, and what would be the figure's trailing arm disintegrates into a patchwork of light. Behind this part of the image, a tree-like form with an extension resembling arms with cupped hands recalls Moore's earlier drawings, like the ghostly right-sided subject of Moore's shelter scene, Two Swathed Figures of 1941. A similar technique is used in Moore's illustration to an excerpt from Auden's Iceland Revisited, where limb-like rock formations accompany a statement of stark isolation. The desolate fjord denied the possibility of many gods. We may also be tempted to wonder whether the sense of human distance comes in part from the way that Moore produced the Auden series. 9 of the 31 illustrations were adapted from proofs and other materials made for his Stonehenge series. Could it be that the sense of ghostly indirectness comes from recycling? Does the decontextualization of the process instill the images with a nomadic tone? Any account attributing this reasoning to Moore would have to take account of the circumstances of the artist's work. Mitchinson has noted that even in Moore's compromised state, activity at Perry Green was as frenetic as ever. 1973 is a year where 40 exhibitions open and the artist produces 12 new sculptures, more than 120 works on paper and 82 other graphic works. Moore continued to greet daily visitors and is in the early stages of establishing his foundation. With the artist's graphic work generally carried out with disparate, often internationally based technicians, printmaking was protracted. With the added dimension of creation of a book, Auden Poems, Moore Lithographs was a complex collaboration. It's therefore possible that working from Stonehenge images was an approach informed by practical considerations. Yet the Stonehenge series is apposite for thinking about human presences in Auden. Indeed, amongst Moore's contemporary commentators were those who recognized the artist's images of these giant inanimate stones, potentially communicating something about us as beholders. Moore and Auden's mutual friend Stephen Spender characterized the series as a dumb, terrifying testament to both the shocking potential of human power and our often confused straddling of animal, intellectual, and spiritual. as he states, and this is Spender speaking, "Thus a trilithon seen edge on like head and limbs suggests to me the hunched body, arms and legs forming an almost continuous line, and the dog-nosed head of an Egyptian sculpture in the British Museum. Below this figure, there lies a flat slab of what seems a pool of water, like a prostrate victim. These monoliths had the cruel power of the men who hauled them immense distances and who hammered and hacked at the stone, developing its magical properties of power intrinsic to the material itself." Spender here gives us a kind of conceptual lineage from Stonehenge to the Auden lithographs, symbols of an unstable human condition appropriated for the vocabulary of an atomized humanities representation. I'll now turn to Michael to hear our second set of poems looking at love, loss, and mystery.
Thank you, Tom. So, we go straight back into love here. This is 1965 Auden, so later career, late middle-aged. It's called Since, and I think it's one of his most beautiful love poems. Very different tonally to those early 1930s, rather kind of veiled carpe diem poems. This is a different kind of seize the day because it is set on a particular day. But the epiphany, the moment of magical thought that happens in the poem is about a previous day of love when he was much younger, and it's celebrating that. It's beautifully constructed. In this case, it sounds like a more conversational voice, but it's actually in lines alternating 7 and 5 syllables, which gives it a sort of architectural unity, but equally it makes it flow. So I was going to say it's very easy to read, but now I'll mess it up anyway. So effectively what you've got here is public and private history again. In a later stanza in the poem, you'll hear him alludes to his companions in Kirkstetten, where he lives by then in near Vienna. Since. On a mid-December day, frying sausages for myself, I abruptly felt under fingers 30 years younger the rim of a steering wheel. On my cheek, the parching wind of an August noon. As passenger beside me, you as then you were. Slap across a veg-growing alluvial plain, we raced in clouds of white dust, and geese fled screaming as we missed them by inches, making a beeline for mountains gradually enlarging eastward. Joyfully certain nightfall would occasion joy. There you go. I slipped. It did. In a flagged kitchen, we were served broiled trout and a rank cheese. For a while we talked by the fire, then, carrying candles, climbed steep stairs. Love was made, then and there, so halcyon, soon we fell asleep to the sound of a river swabbling through a gorge. Since then, other enchantments have blazed and faded. Enemies changed their address, and war made ugly an uncountable number of unknown neighbours, precious as us to themselves. But round your image there is no fog, and the earth can still astonish. Of what then should I complain, pottering about a neat suburban kitchen? Solitude? Rubbish. It's social enough with real faces and landscapes, for whose friendly countenance I at least can learn to live, with obesity and a little fame. (1936) we're going back to now. So this is around the same period as the lullaby poem that we started with. This is from a sequence called 12 Songs. A lot of poets are wary of dream poems, like this famous Dylan Thomas poem about one of his essays about how terrible it is to write directly from a dream because you think it's really profound, but those who weren't sharing the dream don't get it. Auden was well aware of this and wary of this, and some of his dream poems aren't really based on dreams. The dream becomes a conceit for creating this air of mystery. This one, it seems, was from a real dream. He's slotted it into these 12 songs, but it seems in many ways quite distinctive. He inverts his guilt is the shorthand for this, according to Edward Mendelssohn. And there's also a Freudian interpretation of this dream, which is the unconscious desire of the speaker to end a relationship or betray a lover is worked out through the dream in it happening to him, the speaker. This is John Fuller, who's a poet and who has written extensively about the detail of Auden's work and life. So 1936, and it's a dream poem. Dear, though the night is gone, its dream still haunts today, that brought us to a room, cavernous, lofty as a railway terminus, and crowded in that gloom were beds, and we in one in a far corner lay. Our whisper woke no clocks. We kissed, and I was glad at everything you did, indifferent to those who sat with hostile eyes in pairs on every bed, arms round each other's necks, inert and vaguely sad. What hidden worm of guilt or what malignant doubt am I the victim of, that you then, unabashed, did what I never wished, confessed another love, and I, submissive, felt unwanted and went out. Tom and I had some fun with this poem. It's called Nocturne, and it's not the only Auden poem called Nocturne. So at one point we were looking at different nocturnes. It's worth saying, while we're talking about that, he was a great one for repeating titles and changing titles, which makes him very hard he's a slippery character when you're looking for particular poems. And his collected poems on my shelf at home are the only one I know, I think, that has a whole separate index of poems under alternative names. So this one is called Nocturne, and it is essentially, this is from 1953. It's been described by John Fuller as a charm against jealousy. So again, the theme is love, again, faithlessness in love, and the brevity, the unreliability of love. It's got a very famous and very brilliant last line, in which the moon asks him to prevent this particular wish, and then the poem makes the wish in the last line. Make this night lovable, moon, and with eye single, looking down from up there, bless me, one especial, and friends everywhere. With a cloudless brightness, surround our absences. Innocent be our sleeps, watched by great still spaces, white hills, glittering deeps, parted by circumstance. Grant each your indulgence, that we may meet in dreams, for talk, for dalliance, by warm hearths, by cool streams. Shine, lest tonight any in the dark suddenly wake, alone in a bed, to hear his own fury, wishing his love were dead. And the last of Auden's poems we're going to read in this session is, we're going back to, he's 24 years old. This is 1931. He's younger than he was when he wrote the lullaby. So this is very early. It's complex. and it's part of a bigger sequence of poems called the Orators. So this is young Auden, incredibly ambitious, the Orators. It's an experimental, surreal, modernist poem that explores ideas of power and the dangers of power and political oratory. It's also it got themes of love about it, and it's still rather coded in the way that often his love-related poems were at this point. But this is the epilogue to the Orators, and it's got a famous first title. "Oh, where are you going?" said reader to rider. "Oh, where are you going?" said reader to rider. "That valley is fatal where furnaces burn. Yonder's the midden whose odours will madden. That gap is the grave where the tall return." "Oh, do you imagine," said fearer to fairer, "that dusk will delay on your path to the pass? Your diligent looking discover the lacking. Your footsteps feel from granite to grass." "Oh, what was that bird?" said horror to hearer. "Did you see that shape in the twisted trees? Behind you swiftly the figure comes softly. The spot on your skin is a shocking disease." "Out of this house," said rider to reader. "Yours never will," said fairer to fearer. "They're looking for you," said hearer to horror, as he left them there, as he left them there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's completely fascinating, beautiful event. And I just wanted to hear a bit more about your collaboration to get to this point. And you were referring to, some of your exchanges and so on. But what's it been like for the two of you to work on this together?
Do you want to start?
Ben and I. No, it's been a real privilege, and it came out of the blue. So Tom can tell you how he settled upon me. Maybe he asked 8 people before, who knows? But then we came down, and I had a fantastic day here going through the archives, and just having is that early stage of a collaboration. As you rightly point out, this is a kind of collaboration as well. In the early stages, you just feel you want to be bombarded with information, so you have a kind of total immersion. So I've already had a total immersion in Auden, partly through making this 3-part series, but also he's always been in my kind of poetic pantheon since I was 18 and first wrote some of his poems. But I knew Moore's work, but didn't know anything about this collaboration, and hadn't seen and really immersed myself in Moore's work. So the first stage for me was doing that, and Tom and his colleagues here were brilliant enablers of that, and opened up extraordinary. I mean, I saw the book, the collaboration itself, but also learned more about Moore's practice at the time and how that related to Auden. So I think theirs was a fascinating collaboration. Perhaps we'll talk about that in a minute, but I found ours fascinating as well, and I've learned a huge amount from doing it, and hope we can continue with in other ways.
I suppose I got the idea, and I gave a talk kind of on a similar note a couple of weeks ago. I'd made this discovery of 6 separate poems about the sculpture king and queen, just whilst doing research on the sculpture on a completely unrelated note. And was kind of fascinated by what happens when you set one medium in another. But I suppose whilst that was sort of sloshing round, sort of fermenting somewhere in the back of my mind, I'd also been on a very interesting visit to the Ashmolean, where I'd first seen these prints firsthand. And I think I was just struck by the tremendous sort of weight and atmosphere of the combination of the poems. And I think it was a question of mood and that atmosphere, rather than necessarily kind of close textual meaning that struck me first. And I guess maybe that's interesting thinking about Moore and Auden's collaboration as well, because without sort of doing Moore a disservice, I have quite a strong impression that it was mood that he picked up on primarily before he then perhaps started to look at the words. Now, quite what that means is something that requires further discussion, but it's a kind of hunch that I think needs developing. So yeah, I guess that was it. And they're kind of black and doomy, and I'm a teenage goth. Like, it works for me. Still. So yeah. Any more questions? Here's.
Thank you. Other people may know a lot more about this than I do. I'm sure you will, Tom. But how typical was it for Moore to collaborate, and where does this fit alongside other collaborations?
I think this is a really interesting question, especially in the context of this season where we're thinking about Moore as the collaborator, because my impression, and this is very much like me speaking as opposed to anybody else, you sort of expert in Moore, is that he is a collaborator, but he's quite selective about what he collaborates on. Somewhere linked to that in my own mind is this sense that Moore's artistic preoccupations are they change, but there is a really strong coherence that runs through his work. There's kind of family resemblance between what he's doing in the early 1920s and what he's doing in the mid 1980s. And the same themes come round, and he sort of orbits around. He's in this holding pattern around these themes. So I suppose the reason that I bring that up is that I would say that the willingness to give somebody access to that vision and to chop and change it isn't necessarily there, but undoubtedly there is a generosity and there is an openness. And I think actually the graphics is a kind of great case study for that collaboration, in as much as when Moore starts really doing printmaking in a kind of serious way, it's very much a kind of late career preoccupation. And he seems very impressed with these kind of expert technicians that he's surrounded by. So he gives over, a lot of that process to them, and something qualitatively different comes out of that. It's not just a recasting of, that coherence that I talked about in a new medium. Is actually a sense that kind of there are new possibilities attached. I mean, actually, another great example is, in the space that we're in now, where we're surrounded by Moore's tapestries, which, are very similar in that sense, and also similar in the sense of being something that we took up late. So yeah, I mean, I think Moore is a collaborator, but I think there are strong qualifications to that.
Can I just say a bit about Auden as a collaborator, because I wouldn't really sort of talked about that. So this is he had collaborated with all kinds of other poets. He'd written plays, he'd co-written sequences of poetry, but the ones that he was proudest of, I think, or felt were most significant, were his collaborations with composers, and they were complicated because there was a complex dynamic, partly because when he was working with Stravinsky, for example, and later with Benjamin Britten, he was a co-librettist with his partner, the American poet Chester Kalman. So although there's you can actually, I think, see which bits Auden was writing, he was very keen not to break the sense of that partnership. So he was collaborating within a wider collaboration with a composer, and they were oddly unbalanced. So Stravinsky was more, I think, more famous. He was the senior figure in that relationship, and it was patchy and complicated, I think, although they produced some great work. With Benjamin Britten, Auden was the senior figure, was better known further on with his career. So again, there was an imbalance. The fascination about this one was, had it been maybe a year or 2 years earlier, you'd have had two artists who were both titanic in reputation and at the same sort of late flowering stage of career. But it wasn't like that. In a sense, although the work it produced is beautiful and profound from Moore's point of view, as you heard, Auden's contribution to this collaboration was poems that he'd written many, many years before. We don't know what conversations came into it from Auden's side, but in that sense, it was a sort of, not contrived, but it was a constructive collaboration. A coming together by, I think, who was it? What was her name? Russell? Vera Russell,
Yeah.
who was passionate about both their work and knew both of them. And we were talking earlier about the slightly arbitrary hook that she gave it. They were both Yorkshiremen. I decided to put these two together. I mean, Auden left York, where he was born, at 1. And then went to school in various other places. He liked to describe himself as having an affinity with the north and being a northerner, but the landscapes that were really formative for him imaginatively were in Durham and higher up than Yorkshire, those bleak post-mining engineering landscapes that he found so fascinating, all these sort of organic-looking rusted machinery up on the high hills. So the idea that they would regard themselves as two Yorkshiremen might have been true of Moore. I don't think it was true of Auden at all. But clearly, I suppose Vera Russell wanted some sense of an easy hook, as anyone does when they're organising events, an easy hook to say why I brought these two together. But really, I think she was just, as the rest of us would have been, fascinated to see what they made of each other.
I think that's I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, what the colleague Sidan was talking about, the kind of the mining link between the two, and actually the Auden series, it was sort of, I was talking to David Mitchinson, who worked on the project back in 1973. He talked about how the exhibition at the British Museum was sort of an opportunity for the coal mining drawings, which were sort of seen as the lesser of the two sets of war drawings, to really get kind of renowned by the public. But I guess I'm interested in, to what extent you see a kind of, I don't know, is there a common interest in mining and others doing the same thing? What was Auden's interest in those machines which he's saying?
As a child, he thought he was going to study engineering, and that was his great fascination. He designed almost like imaginary worlds, but they were imaginary worlds in which industrial processes were taking place using those old rusted. I mean, if you've been up to the hills, the High Pennines above Rookhope, and that's the area he knew best, and they're still there. These battered, rusted, sort of dinosaur-like machines up in the landscape, and they completely captivated him. So it was only years later, I think in his teens, when a friend was having a conversation with him and said, you ought to try writing poems, and that was a epiphany moment for him, and that was that. But up until that point, his imaginative world was built around that kind of mining landscape with the mining machinery. And I mean, I think most of his fascination with it was surface rather than the actual darkness and the underground, the subterranean world. But of course, in poems like in Praise of Limestone, he is engaging with the rock and the earth and the substance of that. I'm only laughing because as several people might know, lithography is a process that a wax drawing is made on a piece of limestone, and I work so hard to try and get kind of conceits around Praise of Limestone you get to this effect. Good thought. Yeah. See, that'd be pretty. So, I mean, there's quite a long history of Moore illustrating poetry. Probably not in as much of a series as the Auden work, although actually probably the 1951 collection of Prometheus, of the Goethe illustrations he did,
might be another example. Or there's an Edward Sackville West work of the mid-40s as well, which is kind of quite illustrative and has this kind of narrative, although in a slightly different way. Did Auden ever collaborate with somebody who, you know, is kind of no longer with us, maybe in the way that Moore did with this work, or somebody who was less present? And do you see any parallels between what Moore does here?
It's interesting. I mean, he was Auden is densely allusive in his poetry and his essays. So the presence of, for want of a better word, dead writers is there throughout, and dead artists. He's very aware of writing in a tradition, and there's this river that's flowing, and he's in it for now, and he's fully aware of everything that's come before. So I think I can't think of an example of him directly trying to illustrate. I mean, I guess a famous example of this would be Musée des Beaux-Arts, which is his famous poem where he talks about the well, effectively the banality of evil, and it's a Bruegel painting, and he describes it's Icarus falling into the sea, and it's a beautiful poem. If you don't know it, it's worth looking up. But he just describes the mundane circumstances that are going on in the fringe of the painting, and Auden is fascinated by this and says, this is what the old masters knew. They knew that while a terrible thing is happening to the person who's in the center of the frame, and there's a shepherd not even looking, just walking his sheep down the side, and there's a horse scratching its backside, and this fascinated him, and so he's constantly in dialogue with other artists and writers, I think. But he, in a way, the sense of Auden as a collaborator with other artists is complicated by the very particular views he felt about the responsibility of poets working with composers. He had a very, very, very high view of opera and of the role of the composer. So he's got some essays, which I still think are among the best essays for poets who want to work with composers or are working with composers. But he lays down, this is the composer's medium. This is you being submissive to what the composer needs. And he says, your words are there to inspire the composer. They can be absolutely glorious in themselves, but if they don't inspire the composer, you have failed. Yeah. So it's not an equal partnership at all. It really is. You're making these things. He describes it as a private letter to a composer, is what you have to write. So it's
private letter being read by everybody else.
Yeah. Well, you're writing a private letter, and the composer makes it a public.
I see.
So you're writing a private letter, which is there just to inspire the composer.
Right.
So it's a very, I mean, as is often the case with Auden, he's not just participating in an act as a poet. He's writing about what it means to be participating in the act. Yeah. At the same time. So his collaborations are complex, but rich. Yeah.
I mean, did that at all? So you collaborated like yourself. Like, do you write private letters? Like, that influenced your approach at all?
It certainly influenced my approach with working with composers, which I've done a lot for about 30 years with two composers in particular, James McMillan and more recently Emily Howard. And yeah, I write different texts for both of them. So in that sense, Auden is in the back of my mind when these relationships are beginning. And I teach poetry. I'm professor of poetry at Manchester Metropolitan University, and we just had a PhD collaboration between us and the Royal Northern College of Music, which is right next door to us, where one of their student composers did a PhD writing an opera, the music for an opera, which one of our student poets did a PhD writing the libretto. So it was really interesting. Not uncomplicated, working between two institutions, but we got there. They made a piece which was then performed by the BBC Philharmonic, and it was great. But I know that when I was working with the poet Niall Campbell, we talked a lot about Auden's essays and Auden's. ideas of the specificity of that particular collaborative dynamic between poet and composer. And I think Niall's acceptance of that, or agreement with Auden, seemed to open the door to it being really successful, which it wasn't.
That feels like an appropriate moment for you to prompt any audience questions.
We were wondering if Moore, he does do also a lot of education. He has an education thing in his work. And if you see his poem work as an educational methodology, like Frere and other, from that time.
Interesting. More or Auden?
Sorry?
More or orders? Which of the two? Or both?
Especially Moore.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Whether the work is at all a sort of template for a methodology, I'm not sure. But I could say that my perception is that Moore took his educational role and his sort of public profile as an articulation of what an artist at that point in history should be incredibly seriously. And he speaks pretty regularly in public on that theme. I think the work itself, I think it has principles in it which are very consistent with such a message. And I'm quite obsessed by the works on paper, and the works on paper, part of their appeal is that sense of iteration and development, which perhaps might have something about it that could perhaps be thought of as a methodology. I wonder whether there's something similar. You talk about how elusive coordinates. Is there something similar going on there for him, do you think?
I don't know. It's there are many ways to talk about Auden and education and Auden methodology. He doesn't. I think he's very complex. In different periods in his life, he works in very different ways with different intent. I think the main thing, in terms of, there are several things that Auden, I think, gives to other poets, and that gives him a particular place in terms of the training and development of other poets. One is he has an extraordinary ear. So he has a particular way. He writes in a variety of forms, but he's extraordinarily adept at using those forms in a way that doesn't sound clunky, that's subtle and beautiful and musical. And the example of this being sort of passed on to other poets is, the best known example is the Boston US Master's Program for Poets, which started running in the 1980s, with Derek Walcott, the Nobel Prize winner, teaching on it. Seamus Heaney taught on it. Joseph Brodsky, a Russian poet, taught on it. And I've spoken to people who went, contemporary American poets who went to that course. And on the first session, he puts Auden's, this is Derek Walcott particularly, put Auden's poem, The Fall of Rome, in front of them, which is a majestically brilliant poem. And he says, your task for this week is to memorize The Fall of Rome perfectly. So when you come next week, you have the whole thing in your head. And the whole premise for this is having Auden poems in your head will change the way that your own ear in terms of your own poems is. And actually just knowing them and reading them every day isn't the same. You have to have them carry the music in your head, and then it will affect the music of your poems. So he's very influential.
I just realized as well, I completely took the scenic route in answering your question as well. That Moore was also a teacher, so it's worth adding that. And it's always very interesting hearing the accounts of his students about how he developed. So yeah, what much.
And maybe we can add also that the time of the collaboration for the portfolio wasn't too far over the few years before he founded the Henry Foundation, which obviously is a charitable organisation to promote the continuation of learning about his work, but also sculpture broadly. And I think, as you illuminated, the history of his work is obviously wrapped up in the history of many other artists, and his role as an educator and a teacher, both on site, but also through his advocating for the arts more broadly, I think is so. I think you can quite nicely see some of the subtle ways in which he illuminates Auden's work through this portfolio, highlighting those words.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right. Any more for anyone? Yes.
Hi.
Hello.
That was a beautiful and thoughtful presentation, both overview, so thank you very much to that. And I imagine that you probably have to be quite selective in what you included, and were there any other poems or lithographs that you would like to give a mention to?
Yes. I mean, I think on the Moore side, one of the great disappointments is that portfolio that I quite briefly mentioned at the beginning, because, it's primarily a poetry reading, there's quite a lot of things that it was stressed were part of the project, but didn't have a literary counterpart. And I think that's probably more indicative than quite a few other things about Moore's feeling on the collaboration as well, and exactly what he was doing when he interpreted the poems. It's something wider than just those bodied work. So it would have been really nice to include those as well. But there were some selections that we didn't include as well. It's about a third of the poems. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, we know. There were some. It would have taken all day. We'd have to have started in the morning. Some of the poems were more responded to a tiny excerpt, but in order to explain where the excerpt came from, we'd have had to read some colossal stuff. And Auden his work can be incredibly dense and incredibly complex. And I mean, he pushes towards being a philosophical poet in places. I don't know whether he would have liked that title, but there's ideas are being worked through that are often quite complex. And there's the one we were both fascinated by was Dictum Vade, which was one of the ones he said, but is really a poem about the inability to write a poem about the ideas that he's expressing, including love, and it becomes a poem about non-poetry and the inability of the poet to make, and it's so self-referential, complex, and elusive.
And his excerpts as well.
And its excerpts, so you have to put them in context. So there were practical reasons why some of them were hard to bring in, but for me, Auden's endlessly fascinating. So any of them, we could have picked any selection, but these, I guess, it included some of the best known ones. Lullaby. How can you not have Lullaby? And then we like the sort of link between Lullaby and Since, the late love poem, where he's talking about himself as being chubby and cooking sausages on his own. There's just a beautiful symmetry between the later Auden love poem and the early one. So I guess we were trying to take a shape, form a shape out of what we could do within the time. But it would always been lovely to do a series, talk about them all.
How are we for time?
I think speaking of time, it probably is time to bring it to a close. I'm sorry to say, I think we may need to release everyone back into the humidity. I can see people shivering.
Is it just worth mentioning as well, like we've got a couple more events coming up towards the end of the season. I can't quite remember you.
That's fine, and that's fine. I just wanted to thank you both very much for convening today. Tom, thank you for curating the event and your thoughtful insights into the portfolio. And Michael, really, we're so thrilled to be able to collaborate with you, and really appreciate bringing your voice and bringing these poems to life today for us. And I think also it's sort of sparked probably some further conversations we can have and ways of investigating this collaboration and Northern leadership to Auden. So thank you really both so much. I think as Tom mentioned, this is part of the Encounter series of this is our theme for this public season. And as many of you know, we're open to the public from April usually until the end of October. We close on the 2nd of November this year. And we have a season theme each year, and this year it's Encounters, really just celebrating Moore's relationships with the very sort of broad creatives that he worked with. And we had one event earlier this year on architecture, and we've got 2 more coming after the summer holidays. At the end of September, we have a discussion between contemporary artist Eva Rothschild and 2 of the original West Indian weavers who worked on these particular tapestries that you see here. Eva Rothschild has recently collaborated with West Indian on her own tapestries, which you can see at Sadler's Wells East. So they'll be here talking at the end of September about weaving, a relationship of sculptures to then producing in textile. And at the end of October, we've got Mary Moore, Henry Moore's daughter, in conversation with Anthony Penrose, who is the son of Roland Penrose and Lee Miller, 2 of the Surrealist artists. And so we'll be exploring Moore's relationship to those 2 particular creatives and the Surrealists more broadly. So we are sort of continuing, sort of darting around. It was very difficult to pinpoint the sort of 4 specific disciplines or sort of areas to focus on, but we hope to sort of reach more broadly through each of the events. So we welcome you back for those. And we do have a couple of archive open events as well. Our afternoons where we open the archive to talk more broadly and show some of the materials in the archive, which really is sort of the core of everything we do here. The archive is across the road from the visitor centre, or across the pathway, and that's where most of the sort of jewels of information that these events are held, and we also support others in their research too. They're open to the public by appointment, so you're all welcome to come anytime. And we do have a film screening as well at the archive, and that's the beginning of October. That will be in here, and it's a series of archive footage or films from the archive that haven't been seen before. I couldn't tell you what they are yet. We're still working on that, but we will have an hour more screening. So look out for that in the newsletters. Thank you all so much.
Yes.